2 weeks after the successful state visit, the royal family gathered in the blue drawing room at Windsor Castle for what had been scheduled as a routine weekly briefing. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting elegant patterns across the antique furnishings and oil paintings that had witnessed countless similar meetings over the centuries. Princess Charlotte entered the room with a confidence that had been notably absent from her demeanor in recent months. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm and took her usual seat at the polished mahogany table with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm for the proceedings ahead. Queen Camilla was already seated at the head of the table, reviewing a stack of briefing papers with her private secretary. When she looked up to acknowledge Charlotte's arrival, there was a warmth in her expression that hadn't been present during their difficult conversation in the garden. The success of the state visit had clearly shifted something fundamental in their relationship. Prince William entered a few minutes later, followed by several senior advisors and staff members who would be participating in the day's discussions. The atmosphere in the room was notably more positive than it had been during recent family meetings, with an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested significant announcements were forthcoming. "Before we begin with the regular agenda items," Camilla said as the meeting officially commenced, "I want to address some changes we're considering in Charlotte's role and responsibilities within the family." Charlotte looked up sharply, clearly surprised that her future duties were going to be discussed in this formal setting rather than in a private family conversation. She glanced toward her father, who gave her an encouraging nod that suggested he was fully aware of what was about to be proposed. "The feedback we received from last week's European delegation has prompted us to reconsider how we utilize Charlotte's particular talents and interests," Camilla continued. "Minister Marchetti specifically requested that Charlotte be included in the upcoming educational summit in Rome, citing her knowledge of international literacy programs and her insights into youth engagement strategies." The room fell silent as the implications of this announcement settled among those present. Invitations to participate in high-level international conferences were not typically extended to royal family members until they had demonstrated years of consistent engagement with specific issue areas. For Charlotte to receive such recognition after just one interaction was unprecedented. Additionally, William added, "We've been in discussions with the Commonwealth Education Foundation about creating a new youth ambassadorship role that would allow Charlotte to work directly with educational initiatives across member countries. The position would involve substantial travel and require her to develop expertise in policy areas that she's already shown natural aptitude for." Charlotte's eyes widened at this news. The opportunity being described was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had been hoping for, but she had never expected it to be offered so quickly or in such a substantial form. From her position near the door, Sergeant Major Rebecca Hayes maintained her usual professional demeanor while observing the family dynamics unfolding around the conference table. As the senior security officer present, she would need to begin immediate planning for the expanded travel and public engagement schedule that these new responsibilities would require. But she was also personally invested in seeing how Charlotte would respond to this unexpected opportunity. "There would, of course, be conditions," Camilla said, her tone becoming more serious. "This level of responsibility requires absolute commitment to preparation and professionalism. There would be no room for the kind of casual approach to duties that has characterized some of your recent behavior." Charlotte straightened in her chair, clearly understanding that this was a pivotal moment in her relationship with the family and her future role within the institution. "I understand completely. The work we discussed during the state visit made me realize how much I still need to learn, but also how much I want to contribute to these efforts." "The educational summit in Rome would be your first major international assignment," William explained. "You would be representing not just our family, but Britain's commitment to international educational cooperation. The preparation would be intensive, and the expectations would be high." "I'm ready for that," Charlotte replied without hesitation. "I've already started researching the issues that will be discussed at the summit, and I've been in contact with Professor Williams about arranging additional tutoring sessions on international policy." Hayes noted the transformation in Charlotte's voice and body language as she discussed these new opportunities. The defensive, resentful teenager who had argued with Queen Camilla in the garden had been replaced by a focused young woman who was clearly energized by the prospect of meaningful work. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Camilla said, pulling a folder from her briefing materials. "The role we're considering for you would require a significant increase in security protocols and public visibility. You would need to be prepared for much more intense media scrutiny and public attention than you've experienced before." At this mention of security considerations, Hayes stepped forward slightly, ready to provide input if requested. Her assessment of the security implications had already been completed and submitted to the Royal Protection Command, but she was prepared to discuss any concerns that might arise during the meeting. "Sergeant Major Hayes will be briefing you on the enhanced security measures that would be implemented," Williams said, turning toward the security officer. "Rebecca, would you please outline the primary considerations?" Hayes moved to the table and opened her own briefing folder. "Your Highness, the international travel component of these new responsibilities would require coordination with security services in multiple countries. You would need to be prepared for more restrictive movement protocols and more extensive advance planning for all public appearances." Charlotte listened attentively as Hayes outlined the security requirements, asking thoughtful questions about how the protocols would affect her ability to engage naturally with people during official events. It was clear that she was taking these considerations seriously rather than viewing them as annoying restrictions on her freedom. "The most significant adjustment," Hayes continued, "would be in your daily routine here in Britain. The increased public profile would require us to modify some of your current activities and locations to ensure appropriate security coverage." "What kind of modifications?" Charlotte asked. "Some of your current social activities might need to be relocated to more secure venues. Your travel between residences would require advanced coordination, and your personal staff would need to be expanded to include additional protection officers." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. The work we're discussing is important enough that I'm willing to accept those limitations." The conversation continued for another hour, covering logistical details, preparation timelines, and performance expectations. Throughout the discussion, Hayes observed the genuine enthusiasm that Charlotte displayed for every aspect of her potential new role. The young princess asked detailed questions about everything from briefing materials to cultural protocols, demonstrating the kind of thorough engagement that had been notably absent from her approach to previous royal duties. When the formal meeting concluded, Charlotte remained in her seat as the other attendees began to file out of the room. She appeared to be processing everything that had been discussed, and Hayes noticed that her hands were trembling slightly with what seemed to be a combination of excitement and nervousness. "Charlotte," Queen Camilla said as she gathered her papers, "I want you to know that I'm proud of the maturity you've shown in handling this opportunity. Your behavior during the state visit and your response today demonstrate that you're ready for increased responsibilities." Charlotte looked up at her step-grandmother with an expression that was free of the defensiveness and resentment that had characterized their recent interactions. "Thank you, Camilla. I know I haven't always made things easy, and I appreciate that you're willing to give me this chance." "Everyone deserves the opportunity to find their own way of contributing," Camilla replied. "What matters is that you found something that engages your passion and utilizes your abilities. That's what real service looks like." As the two women prepared to leave the drawing room, Charlotte turned to address Sergeant Major Hayes, who was reviewing her security notes near the window. "Sergeant Major, may I ask you something?" Hayes looked up from her papers, slightly surprised to be addressed directly. "Of course, Your Highness. During the state visit, I noticed that you seemed to be observing more than just security concerns. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how I handled those interactions with the delegation." Hayes considered her response carefully. In her 8 years of royal protection duty, she had rarely been asked for personal observations about royal family behavior. But Charlotte's question seemed genuine, and Hayes sensed that an honest answer would be appropriate. "Your Highness, I observed that you were able to balance formal protocol requirements with genuine personal engagement. The guests responded positively to your authenticity while still receiving the respect and courtesy that the occasion demanded. From a security perspective, that kind of natural interaction actually makes my job easier because it creates a more relaxed atmosphere." Charlotte smiled at this feedback. "I was worried that I might have been too informal or that I had said something inappropriate." "Not at all, Your Highness. If anything, Your approach seemed to put everyone at ease while still maintaining the dignity that such occasions require. That's exactly what I was hoping to achieve, Charlotte said with evident relief. I want to honor the traditions and protocols that are important, but I also want to connect with people in a way that feels real and meaningful. Hayes nodded approvingly. Based on what I observed, you succeeded in finding that balance. As Charlotte left the drawing room to begin her preparation for the Rome summit, Hayes remained behind to coordinate security arrangements with Prince William's private secretary. But her thoughts continued to focus on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed in the young princess over the past few weeks. The rebellious teenager who had argued with Queen Camilla in the garden had evolved into a thoughtful young woman who was eager to embrace meaningful responsibilities. The change had been dramatic, but Hayes sensed that it represented Charlotte's true nature finally, finding appropriate expression rather than a fundamental personality shift. 3 days later, Hayes received word that Charlotte had been formally confirmed for participation in the Rome Educational Summit. The princess had impressed the conference organizers during a preliminary video briefing, and they had requested that her role be expanded to include participation in a youth leadership panel that would be broadcast internationally. When Hayes informed Charlotte of this development during a routine security briefing, the princess's reaction was one of pure joy mixed with determination. "This is exactly what I hoped would happen," Charlotte said. "Finally, I feel like I'm going to be doing something that really matters." The transformation was complete. Princess Charlotte had found her purpose within the royal framework. Queen Camilla had discovered an effective approach to mentoring her step-granddaughter, and the institution had gained a passionate advocate for meaningful international engagement. The confrontation that had begun in a castle garden had evolved into a breakthrough that would shape the future direction of Charlotte's royal career. Hayes completed her final security assessment for the Rome trip with a sense of satisfaction that extended beyond professional accomplishment. She had witnessed a young woman discover her true calling, and she had played a small but important role in ensuring that the process unfolded safely and successfully. The royal family's future was in capable hands, guided by both tradition and innovation, respect for the past, and enthusiasm for positive change. The story that had begun with conflict and misunderstanding had transformed into one of growth, mutual respect, and shared commitment to service that would benefit not just the royal family, but the many people whose lives would be touched by Charlotte's future work in educational advocacy and international cooperation. The state visit began 3 days later with all the pageantry and precision that the British royal family had perfected over centuries. The morning air was crisp as dignitaries from the European delegation arrived at Windsor Castle, their motorcade winding through the carefully manicured grounds, while security personnel maintained their vigilant watch from strategic positions throughout the estate. Princess Charlotte stood in the grand reception hall, wearing a navy blue dress suit that had been selected by her styling team weeks in advance. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore the diamond earrings that had belonged to her great-grandmother. To outside observers, she appeared every inch the composed young royal, ready to fulfill her ceremonial duties with grace and dignity. But Sergeant Major Rebecca Hayes, positioned near the main entrance as part of the security detail, could see the subtle signs of tension in the princess's posture. Charlotte's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she kept glancing toward the ornate clock on the far wall, as if counting the minutes until the formal proceedings would be over. Queen Camilla entered the reception hall a few minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She had chosen a sophisticated burgundy ensemble that projected both authority and warmth, and her demeanor suggested she was completely in her element. As she moved through the room, greeting various officials and family members, her eyes briefly met Charlotte's across the crowded space. The look that passed between them was loaded with the memory of their recent conversation in the garden. Charlotte's expression remained neutral, but Hayes noticed the slight lift of her chin, a gesture that could be interpreted either as resolution or defiance. Prince William joined the gathering moments later, accompanied by Catherine and their younger children. The family formed a receiving line according to protocol, with each member taking their designated position for the formal welcome ceremony. Charlotte took her place between her Aunt Catherine and her younger brother, Prince Louis, who was making one of his first appearances at such a significant state function. As the European delegation was announced and began to make their formal entrance, Hayes observed the practiced choreography of royal protocol unfolding with clockwork precision. Each bow, each handshake, each exchange of pleasantries had been rehearsed and refined through decades of similar events. The royal family moved through their roles with the kind of effortless grace that only came from years of training and experience. But Hayes also noticed something else unfolding beneath the surface of formal ceremony. As Charlotte greeted each member of the visiting delegation, there was a subtle transformation in her demeanor. The young princess was engaging more genuinely with the guests than Hayes had expected, asking thoughtful questions about their journey and their countries rather than simply reciting the polite pleasantries that protocol required. When Charlotte was introduced to Dr. Elena Marchetti, Italy's youngest minister of education, something particularly significant seemed to occur. The two women, both young and accomplished in their respective roles, began a conversation that extended well beyond the usual brief exchange of formal greetings. "Your Highness, I've read about your advocacy work with youth literacy programs," Dr. Marchetti said in accented but fluent English. "It's refreshing to see someone of your generation taking such initiative in educational reform." Charlotte's response surprised everyone within earshot, including Queen Camilla, who was greeting other guests nearby, but clearly listening to the exchange. "Thank you, Minister Marchetti. I've actually been studying some of the innovative approaches your country has implemented in rural schools. The mobile library program in Tuscany is particularly inspiring." Hayes watched as Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly at Charlotte's response. It was clear that the young princess had been doing research and preparation that went far beyond what had been outlined in her official briefing materials. The depth of knowledge Charlotte displayed during her conversation with the education minister suggested she had been taking her responsibilities more seriously than her recent behavior had indicated. The formal ceremony continued with a tour of the castle's staterooms, where the visiting delegation would view historical artifacts and learn about the cultural significance of various royal collections. Charlotte was assigned to escort Minister Marchetti and two other officials through the Queen's Gallery, where several priceless paintings and sculptures were on display. As the group moved through the gallery, Hayes maintained her discreet security presence while observing the interactions between Charlotte and her guests. The princess had clearly done extensive preparation for this assignment, as she was able to provide detailed information about each piece they viewed, including historical context that wasn't typically included in standard tour scripts. This portrait of Queen Victoria was painted during the final year of her reign, Charlotte explained as the group paused before a particularly striking oil painting. What many people don't realize is that it was commissioned not by the royal family, but by the Women's Social and Political Union as a tribute to the Queen's support for women's education initiatives. Minister Marchetti looked impressed. "I wasn't aware that Queen Victoria had been involved in supporting women's educational causes. That's not typically emphasized in the historical accounts I've read. It's one of the aspects of royal history that doesn't always receive as much attention as military campaigns and political alliances," Charlotte replied thoughtfully. "But many of the women in our family have used their positions to quietly advance causes that might not have received support through traditional political channels." Hayes found herself genuinely intrigued by this side of Princess Charlotte that was emerging during the state visit. The young woman who had been so dismissive and rebellious during her conversation with Queen Camilla was now demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both history and diplomacy that seemed to contradict her earlier behavior. As the tour continued, Charlotte guided the group to the library, where a special exhibition had been arranged featuring historical documents related to international diplomacy and cultural exchange. The princess had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this portion of the visit, as she was able to discuss the significance of various treaties and agreements in remarkable detail. This document represents one of the first formal cultural exchange agreements between Britain and the European continent, Charlotte explained, indicating a carefully preserved manuscript under glass. It was signed in 1887 and established the framework for the educational programs that eventually evolved into many of the international partnerships we maintain today. Dr. Marchetti leaned closer to examine the document. "The language is fascinating. It's much more progressive than I would have expected for that time period. I think our ancestors understood something that we sometimes forget today, Charlotte said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Real diplomacy isn't just about trade agreements and military alliances. It's about building connections between people, sharing knowledge, and creating understanding across cultural boundaries. From her position near the library entrance, Hayes watched as Queen Camilla appeared in the doorway, having apparently been drawn by the sound of animated discussion coming from within the room. Camilla's expression as she observed Charlotte's passionate engagement with the guests was complex, showing what appeared to be a mixture of surprise, pride, and perhaps a touch of concern. The conversation in the library continued for nearly an hour, far longer than had been scheduled for this portion of the tour. Charlotte and Minister Marchetti had discovered a shared interest in educational reform policies, and their discussion had expanded to include the other guests, who were eager to share their own perspectives on international cooperation in various fields. Your Highness, I hope you don't mind my saying this, but your insights into these matters are quite remarkable for someone of your age, commented Ambassador Henrik Larsson from Denmark. Have you considered pursuing formal studies in international relations? Charlotte's response was immediate and passionate. I've actually been thinking about exactly that. There's so much potential for our generation to approach these challenges differently, to find solutions that previous generations might not have considered. It was at this moment that Queen Camilla stepped fully into the library, her presence immediately noticed by everyone in the room. I hope you're all finding the exhibition informative, she said graciously, but her eyes remained focused on Charlotte. Your granddaughter has been an exceptional guide, Your Majesty, Dr. Marchetti replied warmly. She's provided insights that have made this visit much more meaningful than a typical ceremonial tour. Camilla smiled, but Hayes could see the questions forming behind her composed expression. The Queen was clearly trying to reconcile this poised, knowledgeable young woman with the defiant teenager she had confronted in the garden just a few days earlier. As the official tour concluded and the visiting delegation was escorted to the dining hall for lunch, Charlotte found herself walking alongside Queen Camilla toward the private family quarters. For several minutes, they walked in silence, both clearly processing what had just occurred. That was quite impressive, Charlotte, Camilla finally said, her tone carefully neutral. Charlotte slowed her pace and turned to face her step-grandmother. You sound surprised. I suppose I am somewhat. Your performance today doesn't exactly align with the behavior and attitudes you've been displaying recently. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do, Charlotte replied, but her tone lacked the defensive edge that had characterized their previous conversation. Maybe I don't, Camilla acknowledged, but I'm curious about this apparent contradiction. If you're capable of this level of engagement and preparation, why have you been so dismissive of your other royal duties? Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been in weeks. Because most of those other duties feel meaningless. Ribbon cuttings and charity photo opportunities where I just smile and say the same scripted words over and over again. Today felt different. Today felt like I was actually contributing something real. Hayes, who had been following at a discreet distance to ensure security, found herself inadvertently eavesdropping on this continuation of the conversation she had witnessed in the garden. She could see that both women were struggling with complex emotions and competing perspectives. So you're saying you want more substantive responsibilities? Camilla asked. More opportunities to engage with real issues rather than purely ceremonial duties? I'm saying I want to feel like what I'm doing matters, Charlotte replied. I want to use whatever influence and opportunity this position gives me to actually make a difference, not just to maintain traditions that might not be relevant anymore. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince William, who appeared to be looking for both of them. The delegation is asking about you, Charlotte. I think you made quite an impression during the tour. Charlotte's face brightened noticeably at this news. Really? They seemed engaged, but I wasn't sure if I was providing the kind of information they were looking for. According to Ambassador Larsson, you provided exactly the kind of substantive discussion they were hoping for. He specifically mentioned that he was impressed by your knowledge of current educational policy issues. Hayes observed the change that came over both Charlotte and Camilla at this news. The princess stood a little straighter, clearly pleased by the positive feedback, while the queen's expression showed what appeared to be a dawning recognition of possibilities she hadn't previously considered. "We should discuss this further," Camilla said thoughtfully. "There might be ways to structure your future engagements to include more of the substantive work you're interested in." For the first time in weeks, Charlotte smiled genuinely at her step-grandmother. "I'd like that very much." As the three royals headed toward the dining hall to rejoin their guests, Hayes completed her security sweep of the area they had just vacated. The conversation she had witnessed suggested that the conflict between Charlotte and Camilla might be evolving into something more constructive. But she also sensed that this was still just the beginning of a larger transformation that would require careful navigation by all involved. The remainder of the state visit proceeded smoothly, with Charlotte taking an unusually active role in the various ceremonies and discussions. By the time the European delegation departed 2 days later, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the young princess's approach to her royal responsibilities. The question that remained was whether this change would prove to be temporary or represent the beginning of a new chapter in her development as a member of the royal family. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla made her way toward the East Wing Gardens. Her footsteps echoed against the ancient stones, each click of her heels marking a rhythm that seemed to match the urgency she felt building inside her chest. Today was different. Today, she would finally address something that had been weighing heavily on her mind for weeks. Princess Charlotte, now 16 and growing into her role within the royal family, had been displaying behavior that concerned not just Camilla, but several members of the household staff. The young princess had been increasingly dismissive of protocol, openly challenging established traditions, and showing what many considered to be an alarming lack of respect for the institution she was born to serve. As Camilla rounded the corner near the rose garden, she spotted Charlotte sitting on a marble bench beneath an old oak tree. The princess was hunched over her phone, completely absorbed in whatever was capturing her attention on the small screen. Her posture alone spoke volumes about her current attitude toward royal duties and expectations. "Charlotte," Camilla called out, her voice carrying the authority that came with her position, but also a hint of the maternal concern she genuinely felt for her step-granddaughter. The young princess looked up, and, for a moment, Camilla saw a flash of something that might have been guilt cross Charlotte's features. But it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the defiant expression that had become all too familiar in recent months. "Yes, Camilla," Charlotte replied, deliberately omitting any formal address or title. It was a small act of rebellion, but one that did not go unnoticed. Camilla approached the bench and gestured for Charlotte to make room. As she settled beside the teenager, she could feel the tension radiating from the young woman. This conversation had been building for weeks, and both of them seemed to sense that it would be significant. "We need to talk," Camilla said simply, her tone leaving no room for argument or deflection. Charlotte sighed dramatically and put her phone face down on the bench between them. "If this is about the charity event last week, I already explained to Father that I had other commitments. This isn't about one event, Charlotte. This is about a pattern of behavior that has everyone in the family concerned." Camilla's words were measured, but there was steel beneath the surface. "You've missed 3 official engagements in the past month. You've been rude to staff members who have served this family faithfully for decades. And yesterday, I heard from your private secretary that you refused to review the briefing materials for next week's youth mentorship program." Charlotte's jaw tightened, and she crossed her arms defensively. "Maybe I don't want to spend my entire life reading briefing papers and shaking hands with people I don't know. Maybe I want to actually live my life instead of just performing it for cameras." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of accumulated frustration and resentment. Camilla understood the sentiment behind Charlotte's rebellion, perhaps better than the young princess realized. Her own journey to acceptance within the royal family had been long and difficult, marked by public scrutiny and personal challenges that had tested her resolve countless times. "I understand feeling trapped by expectations, Charlotte. I truly do." Camilla's voice softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "But what you seem to forget is that this isn't just about you. Every action you take, every word you speak, every commitment you break reflects not just on yourself, but on the institution your father will one day lead. Charlotte rolled her eyes, a gesture that would have been unthinkable from any royal family member just a generation ago. The institution. Always the institution. What about what I want? What about my dreams and my plans for my own life? And what exactly are those plans? Camilla asked pointedly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your main plan is to avoid any responsibility while enjoying all the privileges that come with your position. The accusation stung, and Charlotte's face flushed red. That's not fair. You don't understand what it's like to grow up knowing that every single day of your life is planned out for you before you even wake up. You're right. I don't understand that specific experience, Camilla acknowledged. But I do understand what it's like to have the entire world watching your every move, waiting for you to fail. I understand what it's like to be criticized for things beyond your control. And I understand what it's like to have to earn respect rather than simply expecting it because of your title. As they talked, neither woman noticed the figure standing in the shadows near the garden's stone wall. Sergeant Major Rebecca Hayes had been making her routine security rounds when she heard voices from the garden. As one of the few female members of the elite Royal Protection Unit, she had learned to be especially observant and discreet. Her training had taught her when to make her presence known and when to remain unseen. Hayes had been protecting the royal family for 8 years, and in that time, she had witnessed countless private moments and difficult conversations. She understood the delicate balance between ensuring security and respecting privacy. But something about this particular exchange made her pause rather than simply moving on to complete her rounds. You think I don't earn respect? Charlotte's voice had risen slightly, though she was still mindful of who might be listening. You think I just expect everyone to bow and curtsy because of my title? I think you've forgotten that respect is something that must be continuously earned, regardless of your birth circumstances, Camilla replied firmly. Your grandmother understood this. Your father understands it. And whether you like it or not, you need to understand it too. Charlotte stood up abruptly, her frustration finally boiling over. My grandmother lived in a different world. Things are different now. People are different. The whole concept of monarchy is being questioned every single day, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it is, Camilla agreed, surprising Charlotte with her response. But that doesn't mean we abandon our responsibilities while we figure out how to adapt. It means we work harder to prove that we deserve the trust people place in us. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps approaching along the garden path. Both women looked toward the sound and saw Prince William walking toward them with what appeared to be an urgent expression on his face. Sorry to interrupt, William said as he drew closer. But we need to discuss the arrangements for next week's state visit. Charlotte, your presence is specifically requested at the welcome ceremony. Charlotte's earlier defiance seemed to deflate slightly at her father's arrival. She looked between Camilla and William, clearly torn between her desire to continue the argument and her reluctance to air family grievances in front of her father. I'll be there, she said quietly, though her tone suggested the commitment was given reluctantly. William studied both women for a moment, clearly sensing the tension that had preceded his arrival. Is everything all right here? We're having a discussion about responsibility and commitment, Camilla said diplomatically. Charlotte, and I have some different perspectives on what those concepts mean for someone in her position. I see. William's tone was neutral, but his expression suggested he was not entirely surprised by this development. Perhaps we should continue this conversation later, when we have more privacy and more time to explore all perspectives. Charlotte seized the opportunity to escape. May I be excused? I have a tutoring session with Professor Williams in 20 minutes. William nodded, and Charlotte gathered her phone and began walking quickly toward the castle. As she passed the stone wall where Sergeant Major Hayes remained hidden, something made her pause and look back toward the garden where Camilla and her father continued talking. Hayes watched the young princess's face carefully, noting the conflict of emotions that played across her features. In her years of protection duty, Hayes had developed an ability to read people quickly and accurately. It was a skill that often proved crucial in identifying potential threats or security concerns. But What she saw in Charlotte's expression wasn't defiance or anger anymore. It was something much more complex. The princess stood there for nearly a minute, watching her step-grandmother and father engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion. Hayes could see Charlotte's hands clenching and unclenching at her sides, a clear sign of internal struggle. When Charlotte finally turned and continued toward the castle, her shoulders were slumped in a way that suggested the weight of the conversation had affected her more deeply than she had wanted to admit. Hayes waited until all 3 members of the royal family had departed the garden area before emerging from her position. As she resumed her security rounds, she found herself thinking about the conversation she had just witnessed. In her 8 years of service, she had seen the royal family navigate countless challenges and difficult moments. She had observed their strengths and their weaknesses, their moments of unity and their periods of tension. What struck her most about this particular incident was not the conflict itself, but the genuine concern she had heard in Queen Camilla's voice. Despite the firmness of her words, there had been an underlying note of love and worry that spoke to the complex relationships within the royal family. These were not just public figures playing roles. They were real people dealing with real family dynamics, complicated by the extraordinary circumstances of their positions. As Hayes completed her rounds and submitted her routine report, she made no mention of the conversation she had overheard. Such discretion was not just expected in her role, it was absolutely essential. But, privately, she found herself hoping that Princess Charlotte would find a way to reconcile her personal desires with her royal responsibilities. The young woman's struggle was one that Hayes understood, having faced her own challenges in balancing personal ambitions with professional duties throughout her military career. The afternoon passed quietly at Windsor Castle, with each member of the royal family attending to their scheduled commitments. But the echoes of the morning's conversation lingered, setting the stage for the changes that would unfold in the days to come. The seeds of a more significant confrontation had been planted, and everyone involved seemed to sense that this was just the beginning of a larger conversation about duty, tradition, and the evolving role of the monarchy in the modern world.